I have seen and studied and analyzed all types of security threats. I've fought in several wars, but there's an emerging threat that we're seeing, and I'd like to talk a little bit about today, that I think will have an effect on our future, our economy, our youth, and our economic system. And it is an emerging threat that concerns me significantly, and it's represented in this picture. My job was to train the 160,000 or so soldiers, or correction, civilians that would come into the Army every year and turn them into soldiers. What I found when I reported to that assignment disturbed me. Several facts came to my attention. First of all, 75% or more, a little bit more actually, of the civilians who wanted to join the Army were not qualified to do so. 75% of the 17 to 24-year-olds that wanted to join the Army were not qualified, and the number one reason was because they were obese. Of the 25% that could join the Army, what we found on the first day of basic training was that about 60% of them could not pass the PT test that we gave on the first day. As we did some analysis, I realized that a couple things had changed. First of all, number one, and the primary reason, was starting in the late 90s, the majority of our elementary and high schools stopped teaching PE. And in fact, only 5 states of the 50 in our country right now have mandatory requirements for physical education between K and 12th grade today. 5 out of 50. Now, you say, okay, well that's interesting, but what does the Army care about that? Well, we were getting the product of that, but in addition, the second and third order effects were young people that were joining our service could not run, dodge, jump, tumble, roll, the kinds of things you expect soldiers to do if they're in combat. It was fascinating to me that we were also seeing, a scientist told me, that in the last 15 years, from the time I left West Point until today, Americans eat about 30% more calories a day than they had in 1983, and about 15 pounds more of sugar a year. Phenomenal statistics. In addition to that, the final one, number 4, is we're terrible examples to our children. We are in too much of a rush. We are eating poorly, we're eating fast foods, we're relaxing in front of the television at the end of the day. We also are relying on technology instead of play, and we're not balancing our lives. My wife has a stitchery in our house as we've raised 2 children and now a couple of grandchildren that says, "Your children are watching you. What you do speaks louder than anything you can say." We were not doing the right things for our children. Your Army, combined with your Navy, your Marine Corps, your Air Force, and your Coast Guard, makes up less than 1% of the American population. So my concern is what's going on with the other 99%. And this gets me back to my issue of this being a national security concern. what I'll suggest to you, I'm going to show you one area, and that's just levels of obesity. This was a chart that represents the number of states in the union that were below 20% obesity rates on average from a child of 14 to 19 years old. This was in 1985. Watch what happens. As you can see, in 2009, it's significantly worse. The predictions for 2030 are these. You can see the number of states that have greater than 65% children obese. This is not overweight, this is obese. Now, the related issues, as I told you, the issue with our injury rates and how much we were paying to fix people is significant. We spend, estimated, the Department of Health and Education both determine that we spend on average today between $150 to $200 billion per year treating the results of childhood obesity. We're seeing an increase in diabetes. We estimate that we'll have a 40% cardiovascular disease rate by the year 2030. This is significant. This is a health cost, a healthcare issue, an economic issue, a readiness issue for me because I'm seeing my pool of recruits deplete based on this. I can't pull them in order to fix them. And it's just a competition issue. There's other studies that show what obesity and lack of activity do to young people. So I believe this is certainly a national security concern.
So y'all, I think we should just jump right into this. I've been on a mostly vegetarian diet for about 3 to 4 years. I'd say maybe 10% of it, of my diet, was animal products. White meat, chicken, eggs, not a lot. Then the rest, the 90% of my other diet was grains, old-fashioned oats, blueberries, bananas, peanut butter, brown rice, jasmine rice, broccoli, asparagus, kale, spinach, all the good stuff, you know. Or so I thought. Started having problems this past year because this type of diet, it's a high carb, kind of high protein, not really high protein, maybe medium protein, and then low fat, very low fat, if no fat at all. And when I wanted to lose weight, I just cut out all the fat and lower the carbs. Learned this from bodybuilding, sure, a lot of you have too. And I did this every time I wanted to lose weight, gain weight, whatnot. This year has been different. When I tried to cut the weight, the inflammation stayed in my face, and it stayed in my gut. And my head was more mentally foggy than usual. I could tell something else was wrong. The inflammation was more so than just bloating this time. It was there to stay, it seemed like. So what I decided to do was, I decided to go on a fast. 7-day water fast. And what came from it, guys, I felt the best I ever felt in possibly my life. I felt 10 years younger, but I felt better than I was 10 years younger. And I can't explain it any better than that. I felt mentally more clear. My body's aches and pains were gone away. A sprained ankle that I had for 6 months dissipated. Gone. And so was my inflammation in my gut and my cheeks. And even myself, a personal trainer, a nutritionist, and I help a lot of clients, I would never say starve yourself to do anything like this. But how could I feel so good if I did that? First of all, guys, if we want to figure out any of that, we have to know what inflammation is.
I am looking for my medical dictionary. Inflammation, here we go. Aha, here we go. The definition of inflammation, derived from the Latin inflammare, meaning to set on fire. When you hear the term inflammation, what comes to mind? Joint pain after a long workout? Redness and swelling after a bee sting? These are examples of acute inflammation, or inflammation specific to one area of the body. Now we're learning much more about another kind of inflammation, chronic inflammation. And your level of chronic inflammation may be very telling about what the future holds for your health. Let's return to the example of the bee sting. In most cases, a person's white blood cells fight off foreign substances. In this case, the poison from the bee sting. White blood cells release powerful chemicals which can damage tissues, causing the redness and swelling that you see after the bee sting. So let's look at this on a larger scale. Say you're someone who eats a lot of processed and refined foods. These foods contain substances that your body doesn't know what to do with. Just as your immune system reacts to the poison from the bee sting, it also reacts to the substances from these foods. Over time, this leads to a general state of inflammation in your whole body. This is when the light bulb goes off when we discuss this with our patients. It's basic. When you don't treat your body well, your immune system attacks. But it's a silent war, one that takes place over time. You don't feel the effects right away. Day after day, white blood cells release a host of chemicals which can damage all of the tissues in your body. Your heart, your lungs, your kidneys, increasing your risk of having a heart attack, a stroke, or even developing diabetes. We are just beginning to understand the relationship between chronic inflammation and cancer, and neurologic disorders such as Alzheimer's disease. Needless to say, the effects of chronic inflammation can be devastating. Sounds scary? It's a wake-up call for sure, but it's also very exciting because we are identifying new ways of treating, detecting, and preventing chronic inflammation. Now we understand. If you eat unhealthy food, your immune system is stuck in a never-ending war. Tissue damage will go on and on and on.
Let's talk about the third cause of inflammation, which is basically insulin resistance. You may already know this. I have a lot of videos on this. I've been talking about this. I'll put some links down below. But if you're new to my channel and you don't know this, this is going to be very important. Insulin resistance is a condition where you're producing too much insulin, okay? That excess amount causes a lot of inflammation in the body. Plus the fact that this is triggered by your high carbohydrate diet and your frequency of eating, okay? So if you eat too frequently and you have too many carbs, you are going to eventually get inflammation.
You know, because when we look at the food guide pyramid, which is a complete joke, and I've talked about this, they mostly advocate, the bottom section is bread, cereal, rice, and pasta, 6 to 11 servings a day. That's what our government wants us to eat the most of. It's more accurate if you actually take the food guide pyramid and reverse it upside down. Basically, just do the exact opposite of what they tell you and you're going to be healthy. This is where it gets confusing because you look at labels and you're like, you see this little American Heart Association on your oatmeal or something. You're like, oh, sweet, you know, this is good for my heart. And they actually studied a similar product, say it was bread, one that had the label of American Heart Association stamped on there, one that didn't have the label. The ones with the label actually had more sugar. They were completely the same. And again, when you say whole grain is the biggest piece of crap I've ever heard, because a whole grain means that you start with a freaking kernel and then you can pulverize it, do whatever the heck you want with it. As long as you started with it before the processing occurred, you can say it's whole grain.
Charles, what would you recommend? Something delicious, light, and low in cholesterol. Do you realize the lower the cholesterol in your body, the lower your chance of heart disease?
Delicious, Charles. Thanks for the tip.
Well, if there's one thing I know, it's a good tip.
The American Heart Association.
We're fighting for your life.